Welcome to another episode of Making the Cut. I am your host, Marcus McWashington, and we have a really, really good show tonight. We're going to kind of break from just talking about, the college football games and NFL games. We talk about that every week, and we're going to talk about that today also. But we wanted to start off um, definitely with something that's near and dear to every sports fan's heart, which is what team did you hate when you were growing up in different sports. And we all had it, and we all probably, none of us probably had a really, really, really good reason why we hated. I mean, maybe it was because that was the rival to whatever team was our designated favorite team, or we didn't like a player, or for some people maybe it was they didn't like the colors. I don't know what the case may be, but we have definitely have gotten some response to it, and we're going to talk about that coming off. But of course, I am joined by my man Brandon Blake. How are you doing tonight, my man?
I'm doing good. How about yourself, man?
I'm doing great, and I've gotten some hits on Twitter about this question, some on Facebook, but I want to start off with you. When it came to, let's just start with the NFL. When it came to the NFL, when you were a kid and you're first really, really, really getting into it, what team could you not just like stand?
Well, I'll say this is full disclosure. I am a Jaguars fan, but only been a Jaguars fan for 2 years. Before that, I spent my teenage years as a Dallas Cowboys fan. So I was a Cowboys fan for about 20 plus years. So my disdain was primarily towards the teams in the NFC East. I didn't have a hatred for anybody else in the NFC, but I really didn't like any of the teams in the NFC East. Didn't particularly care for Pittsburgh, and I guess when you're 13 or 14, you're a teen, you're trying to rebel. I was in the lived in a household with all Steelers fans. My dad was a Steelers fan, 30 years, 30 plus years, and he was a kid from Pennsylvania. So he was a Steelers fan. Mostly everybody in the family was Steelers fans. I had to be the different one. I had to be a Cowboys fan. So I didn't like Pittsburgh. I definitely didn't like Philly, Washington, New York. Really didn't like New York. Got into because of those years when Dallas didn't would always get to that week 16 or week 17 and find a way to lose. Really didn't care for New York. Really didn't care about Washington. So I guess those are the teams I really focused. I kept it within the division. So those three teams, especially New York, Philly, and Washington. So
For me, being a Raiders fan, I hated the Pittsburgh Steelers, and a lot of that. And for those who don't know, I'm 46, even though I obviously do not look like I'm 46, but I'm 46 years old. So basically, it was like that 70s time for me, mid to late 70s, where I absolutely positively hated the Pittsburgh Steelers because it seemed like every year they would play the Raiders in playoffs, and somehow, some way, they would find a way to beat them, whether it was the immaculate reception or whatever the case may be. And then the year that '76, was when Oakland was pretty dominant, and it looked like, hey, this was going to be the year where they're going to get over the hump anyway. It was almost like I compare it to um, probably like '92 Duke. I mean, the disappointments in '86 and stuff like that with Krzyzewski, but you kind of had that feeling that Duke was finally going to get over the hump. You had that
they
feeling,
break through.
yeah, and you had that feeling that Oakland was going to get over the hump, and so they played Steelers in the AFC Championship game, and Franco Harris was hurt. So after the Oakland Raiders dominated the game, the Steelers were like, well, we were banged up, we didn't have everyone and stuff, and just almost tried to cheapen it, and that just really like bugged me. You know, they had been waiting for this. Oakland, on a controversial call on the Immaculate Reception, was heading to the Super Bowl that year before that happened. And by the way, people always ask me, especially younger people, why is that controversial? Back in the NFL then, if I threw a ball and it hit an offensive player, like my wide receiver, and another wide receiver caught the ball, it was not a reception. So the big controversy around that call was who touched the ball first? Was it Lynn Swan or was it Jack Tatum? before Franco Harris caught it and scored. If it was Lynn Swan, the play shouldn't have counted. And that's why younger fans don't understand that, because it's like, I don't see what the controversy is. Well, there is controversy because the rules back then were different. So, that's neither here nor there. And of course, the Denver Broncos, similar to what you just said, a lot of it was because they were a rival. They beat the Raiders. I want to say it was in 77. Uh, Denver had gotten home field advantage, and I do believe that year, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, just hit me up on Twitter at MTC with Moot. But I do believe that year the Broncos had gotten home field advantage against both the Raiders and the Steelers. And I know in the Raiders game, one on a controversial call, whether it was touchdown, not a touchdown, and then they beat the Steelers, and they went on to play the Cowboys in the Super Bowl and they lost. But basically, it was the idea of them being the rival, and I always viewed them as the biggest rival, even though as the early '80s came on, actually the Raiders' biggest threat, so to speak, was actually the San Diego Chargers with Dan Fouts and Winslow and Charlie Jefferson.
The whole air cord, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
It's his birthday.
Yeah, oh yeah, and there you go, right, and that was so for NFL. That was me. For the NBA, my parents, when we were kids, were season ticket holders for the Washington Bullets. They were a big Bullets fan. I was not. I mean, I don't know if it was the rebel thing that you were talking about earlier, but I'll be honest with you, I could have cared less if they won or not, even though in '78 they did win the championship. My parents were absolutely positively elated. And in '79 they made it back to the championship series and they lost to Seattle. But, eventually for me, every little kid wanted to be like Dr. J. So, in my school and stuff like that, everybody wanted to root for the Sixers, and Dr. J. And I'll be honest with you, what ended up happening going to games and seeing these people and seeing guys like George Gervin and Larry Bird when he was very, very young and stuff like that, I started liking players. And the player, because people always ask me, how are you a Knicks fan? And it was because going to those games, I absolutely positively fell in love with Bernard King. And Bernard King just became my favorite player. And then eventually it's just like, man, I watch Bernard King all the time, and the Knicks and so on and so forth. So I started liking the Knicks, and then of course, Bernard King ends up blowing out of his knee. The Knicks end up giving out on him, giving up on him, and then he ends up with the Bullets. I mean, you talk about a total round. But when it came to, I'm telling you, when it came to the NBA, growing up, I absolutely positively hated the Boston Celtics, and you'll have a recurring theme here because at that time I hated every team from Boston, but I hated the Boston Celtics, and I hated the Lakers. I hated both of them. I did not, because people always talk about that was the first golden age of the NBA coming out the '70s. The bad reputation for it, kind of like being a league of drug users and drug abusers.
Like drug users and bad play.
Yeah, exactly.
Overexpansion.
Yeah.
I'm 34, so I mean I didn't experience that. I read about it. You read about it, obviously, looking back, but yeah, it was sort of that first golden age.
Yeah.
We got away from the drug players and the tape delay. Can you imagine?
Yes.
I was reading about this real quick. I hate to cut you off, but what was fascinating to me, they say from the golden age, but there was some good basketball that you just never saw because of tape delays. Magic Johnson's 42-17-5 line came Game 6 of the 1980 Finals, and nobody saw it. And you imagine if LeBron dropped a line like that in the finals, but you had to get up at 3 in the morning to watch it because it was on tape delay. I just a little detour, so.
That used to be crazy because this is like pre-VCR, and you would see the commercials of, Game 6 from the Spectrum on after your local news, which everyone knew started at 11. So, being at that age, it wasn't like, I'm going to be up. We never got to see it in '76, which is really when I first became cognizant of it. The entire Philadelphia 76ers, Portland Trailblazers, championship series was all on tape delay. At least here in the DC area, all those games were on tape delay and was on at like 11:30 at night. And like you said, how can you imagine that? Especially when we talk about in like the Twitter, the social media world. You just can't. It's impossible, impossible to do that.
Yeah, and I'm of an age. I'm 34 for the audience. I'm 34. I was born in '82. My NBA experience really caught on with I vividly remember the Detroit Pistons sort of slaying the whole LA Boston thing. Like that was my team. I remember. Like, damn, I'd be pitting Isaiah and also Blaine Beard, the bad boy Pistons. So I caught on that tail end of that golden age. So I didn't remember see a whole lot of Magic other than old clips. And by then he was pretty much into the line. So you experienced the tape delay, which I, like I said, in this age, like I just mentioned earlier, man, Steph Curry dropped 50 on, Sacramento. I don't have to catch it at 12:30 because it's on tape delay. It's just that whole experience just.
Yeah, it was the worst. But with Magic, I mean, you look forward, and obviously, again, this is before all the packages, but you look forward to when CBS had coverage on the weekends, like Saturday and Sunday during the regular season, because outside of your local team, you didn't get to, see it. Now, the one thing I do remember in '78 with the Bullets and the Supersonics was Channel 20 in the DC area had all of the Bullets home games. But when it came to the championship series, they could show it, but again, they didn't show it at 11:30, and it was only the Bullets home games. Well, no, I think it might have been the Bullets home games in a way. But the point is that instead of it starting at 11:30, it started at something like 8 or 9 o'clock. And I can remember because it would be like about an hour and a half like behind the live action. And I can remember my dad going out to the car and listening to a couple of the games on the radio to see who won. And I'm a firm believer, which I'm sure none of them will ever admit this, that the games that the Bullets won, they went ahead and watched the rest of. Probably the ones that the Supersonics won, they did not, even though I'm sure neither one of my parents would admit that. And by the way, in what is usually what people would think is conventional, growing up, my mom was the bigger basketball fan than my dad. My mom, all my NBA love comes from my mother. She was a huge Bullets fan. She is to this day a Bullets Wizards fan through all of the rigmarole of them stinking and mismanagement and everything else. She's still a fan of that team. But no, Boston and LA, I just never liked. I didn't like the Celtics. I didn't like the Lakers. So when it was the Celtics and the Lakers in the championship series, to me it was almost like a lose-lose. I mean, I guess if you press me on who I wanted to win, it was probably the Lakers because I did hate the Celtics more. But it wasn't one of these things that when the Lakers won that I was happy because that wasn't the case. That wasn't the case at all. I just wasn't a fan of either one of those two teams. And I know you talked about the Pistons stuff like that, and also with the Celtics with Bird and all those teams and stuff like that. But I tell you what, I grew because of being a Knicks fan, and this is more once I had gotten out of my childhood. But you can only imagine how much I hate the Chicago Bulls, right? I mean,
we're pretty much in the same lockstep. I remember because my team as a kid was the Knicks too, and it was the Knicks with Pat Ewing and Starks and that team and that squad that just could never get over the hump of the Bulls. And I was like, you man, I couldn't stand the Bulls. Jordan, Pippen, all of them. I just couldn't do it. That one year they broke through. You were probably going to say it. In '94, they broke through, and Hakeem just cooked them, man. They just got them.
Yeah,
just. Ugh.
And that's the thing. That series will always haunt me because outside Bernard King, my favorite Knick of all time is John Starks, and everyone talks about the Game 7 against Houston, the 1 for 18, 1 for 19, whatever the case may be. And I always remind people, if it wasn't for John Starks, there would never have been a game 7.